Okay, today we are going to talk about how to work with families, which is an important concept for the pediatric world. Families are complex systems, and having a child with a disability adds to the complexity of that system. So, occupational therapists must be prepared to work alongside and with many different families from various cultural backgrounds. The development of a child's occupation cannot be understood without insight into what shapes their daily activities, and that includes their family and cultural values, which is why we heavily emphasize family centered care and cultural competency. We are going to look at a few key questions first. How do we involve family members in pediatric care? What should collaboration look like and feel like? And how does family involvement affect care? Family functions as a dynamic system. Members engage in occupations to fulfill functions of a family. So the example that they talked about in the book, if you have a mom who needs to go to the grocery store and a daughter that's too young to stay home and a son that is old enough to stay home and watch his sister, there's a few different ways that they can go about this, but either way it impacts each person in the family, so each member of the system. So if the mother takes her daughter, it could take a long time to grocery shop. They may not get dinner in on time, but the son may be able to go play with a friend. And if the son stays home for a few minutes to watch his sister, his mother can shop quickly and get dinner started on time. So either way they do it, it impacts each member of the family. And so that's kind of an example of how the family functions as a dynamic system. And that's important to remember when providing recommendations and therapy intervals for families to follow. We're going to talk more about different resources later on, but time is an important thing to consider for families in this dynamic system, especially in what you're recommending. I also recommend you review the box 5-4 on page 131. It has 6 steps that kind of go into detail about this family system model. So now we're going to talk about family subsystems. First, we have parents or guardians. So parents and guardians can be a positive force that contributes to a child's ability to face developmental challenges, or it can be a maladaptive component in the way that their stressors and their frustration can have a negative influence on the child's development. So when we're thinking about maladaptive, think about parents struggling with addiction or struggling to pay their bills and have enough food on the table each day. These stressors can definitely impact a child's growth and their development. Disability can be an additional stressor for many parents. So many of the parents that we are working with have an additional stressor that we may not have had in our families growing up. So it's important to consider how everyone is different and everyone handles different stressors differently. These stressors can also impact marriage. So strong relationships between husband and wife seem to buffer the parenting stress a little bit, including raising a child with a disability. But it's important to keep in mind that we often aren't aware of the strength of parents' relationships. And some of our kiddos will have parents who are married, are together, aren't together, single family homes, raised by grandparents. We'll work with a variety of families, and we need to be prepared to work with all of them, regardless of that impact of stress and how those relationships may change over time. So the next subsystem is siblings. So siblings are an important source of support. Think about, many of you have your own siblings. Think about the relationships you have with your siblings. And it's pretty similar. Sometimes you may have a supportive sibling relationship. Sometimes there may be some conflict. Oftentimes it kind of goes back and forth, but a lot of times we work through those conflicts and still have that support system available to us. And many children with disabilities are the same. They have strong supportive relationships with their siblings, and there can also be conflict. Conflict among siblings is more prevalent for children that are hyperactive or have additional behavioral problems. Their siblings' understanding of the disease or disability also impacts the level of conflict or support provided to them. It's important to also recognize that the roles of siblings, when you're looking at siblings where one of them has a disability or multiple have a disability and then a few are also typically developing, these roles are also often asymmetric. So the typically developing child is often the one leading the play activities or taking additional measures to teach the child how to play those games and how to participate. Or they're picking games specifically that they know their sibling can participate in. So they're really the one kind of taking charge of that and making the modifications for their sibling as needed. They also may end up taking on more of a caregiver role. And if you haven't already, you'll definitely talk about this a lot in geriatrics, but the caregiver role places many additional stressors on individuals. So imagine that those additional stressors being added to a child who is, still developing and still trying to cope with things in their own life, let alone handling that caregiver role as well. It's important that we as OTs are promoting engagement in a variety of activities, and that includes helping children participate in household chores to help the parents and siblings, but also to be able to engage in play activities and relationships with their siblings and family members. The last family subsystem is extended family. Extended family is critically important for the support of parents, but especially of parents with children with disabilities. Interestingly enough, researchers have found that grandparents also go through similar positive and negative feelings and adjustments, similar to what parents go through when they find out their child is diagnosed with a disability. So it's important to consider where they're at in that process and whether they're helping or hindering the success and the support of the child, and how they can help facilitate that. But oftentimes they are used as a support system for the parents and for the child. And it's important to understand that as OTs, we may end up working really closely with some of the kiddos' grandparents. A lot of times we have parents who are working, and we have grandparents that are bringing in the kiddos to their appointments, and that's who we're communicating with every single day. So it's really important to understand each and every family that you're working with, kind of what those dynamics are, and how much you can share with grandparents, or if you need to be making additional phone calls to parents. It's just really important to make sure that you're understanding their needs. So there's multiple family resources available. And some of these resources can be a reason for parent or caregiver stress as well. Because lack of resources is often a big stressor. So we've got financial resources. So that's an important one because parents with children who have disabilities often have many hidden and ongoing expenses. And finances are a huge stressor for most families. And this is even more common with families with a child with a disability. Another thing to consider is within the financial resources is insurance coverage and insurance caps for therapy. These are always a concern of families, and it might not be something that they're even aware of at the time of starting their services. So it's important to be upfront with them and kind of help them make sure they understand those available resources. Another piece of the financial resources is employment or unemployment. We need to kind of consider that a lot of our families either have flexible employment where they're able to leave and take their child to appointments and things like that, and that's great. That means they are in a supportive environment for the most part. But there's also a lot of families that have had to go into unemployment in order to be able to care for their child in the way that they need. Human resources is another area. We need to understand that this is important, especially in the acceptance of a diagnosis. So parents need to be able to understand how to access services, what services are available. They need to have an understanding of their child's conditions and how to care for their child. So it's really important that we help aid them in that understanding and help kind of further their acceptance of their child's diagnoses or difficulties, whatever it may be. So I kind of mentioned this earlier, but time resources is a critical component when it comes to therapy, not just occupational therapy, but therapies in general. We really need to keep in mind what families are able to handle when we're, recommending intensive therapies or we're recommending multiple home programs and things like that. We need to make sure that we're having a conversation with the families about what they can actually do. And sometimes those home programs and intensive therapies are not an option for families. And we need to be supportive of those decisions and kind of help make the best of whatever the family situation is. We had a guest speaker come talk to us last year within the LEND program, and it was a mother of 3 children with disabilities, and she was actually a speech pathologist before she had kids and for a few years after she started having kids. And one of her children saw a speech pathologist, and she recommended multiple home programs and exercises and things they were supposed to do at home. So this mother kind of was telling this story about how she was sitting on the couch and she was doing these exercises and they were spending the 30 minutes that they were supposed to, and her daughter kind of huffed and puffed and indicated that she just wanted to be able to play with her mom. And that's kind of when the mother realized that although she knows how important it is, it's also really important for them to be able to be a family member, to be a parent, to be a sibling, and not always in that therapeutic or teaching role. So it's just really important to make sure you're having those conversations and finding out what families are able and willing to do. And then the last resources that we kind of touch base on is the emotional energy resource. So you need to have the emotional capacity to be able to kind of handle all of these different difficulties accessing these resources and caring for your child with a disability. And the research supports professional assistance and encouragement as a particularly helpful tool for parents. So this is important for us as OTs to keep in mind, that we can really help our parents in this emotional energy resource area. We can be a resource for them. We can provide them information that help kind of fulfill their human resources and their emotional energy resources by having that extra information prepared for them about their child and about what may help their child in certain areas. Okay, so I just want to touch base a little bit on the family life cycles. So families go through cycles all the time of normative and non-normative events, and this is the same for families with and without children with disabilities. So normative events are defined as an adjustment period, such as when a child starts school for the first time, or they're transitioning between an elementary school to a middle school, or a middle school to a high school, or perhaps when they're leaving home for the first time and going to college or going to start a job, whatever it may be. Those are kind of all normative events where your family needs to adjust because roles and routines are going to be different, but it's something that you were kind of expecting or excited for. These are typically events that that you understand are going to be coming. A non-normative event are events that may change the structure and routine of your family, and they're not typically occurring or expected events. So that could be a grandparent coming to live with the family, or maybe a parent has to move the family because of a job. So all of those things are not necessarily what you're expecting to happen, and they still impact the structure and routine of your family. So I think what you really want to take away from the family life cycles is that routine and role designation need to be flexible in order to withstand these non-normative events and to facilitate the coping process for individuals to get through all of these events, whether they're non-normative or normative. And I can't stress enough that it's really important to understand that every family handles these events differently. And you'll see that across everything. Families may accept a diagnosis immediately, and others may take months to fully accept it. So you need to be prepared to work with families regardless of what stage of acceptance they're in and regardless of where they're at in coping with the different stressors such as non-normative and normative events. There are varying impacts of a diagnosis depending on where the child is at in their life. And this can impact the entire family and specifically the parents. So, if you think about it, in early childhood, there's a lot of questions about the timeline for developmental milestones. Where should my child be? How far behind are they? What should we be doing to get them to where they need to be? What's the next step? How can I help get them there? Um, and then there's a lot of frustration for parents and grandparents with that unpredictability, with not knowing what's going to come next and when it's going to come, or if it will ever come. And then you kind of move into the school age, and you'll see that there's a different impact on regarding their diagnoses. So the kids that were diagnosed in early childhood who may have received early intervention now are receiving less services, and there's less options available for them. And that can be really frustrating for families. And there's also a lot of difficulties with the transition from home to school. So there will be certain parents who have difficulty letting them go into the school district and kind of taking a step back in their routines and in their care. And then you'll have other families where the parents were expecting the school to be able to finally take over a lot of that care and a lot of the extra services that the child needs, and that's not always the case. And then you've also got the situations where you get new diagnoses. So you may not have had these diagnoses in early childhood, but you're now finding out for the first time that your child may have a learning disability or something similar to that, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, something that's impacting their school that you wouldn't have known about prior. And then there's also the increased concern regarding friendships. Is my child going to be able to build and maintain friendships? Are they going to have those relationships? How can I help facilitate those? And then we move into adolescence, and that's where the development of self-identity, sexuality, and emotional and economic expectations are huge. There's a lot of developing going on at this time, and it might be things that parents are uncomfortable with and maybe even more concerned about for their child with a disability, including the transition to adulthood. What happens after they move on? Will they be able to get a job? Will they be able to manage their money? Will they be able to manage their home? What happens when the parent is no longer around to help them? These are kind of questions that really start to arise during this adolescent period. And then in the book, they talked about babyish mannerisms no longer being acceptable. And this really hit home to me. I again had a different LEND parent talking to us last year, and she has a now adult male child who can be pretty aggressive. He has autism spectrum disorder, and she was talking about how she always felt it was a little bit unfair. He was always very tall and very large, and with the aggression, that can be pretty scary for people. And he didn't have she called it the cute factor going for him, that some kids with disabilities may have. And regardless of whether a child has this cute factor or not, that really starts to change and diminish on its impact once you get into the adolescence stage. So it's important to understand these things that different families are going through and how they may be feeling about all of these changes. Okay, so we hear a lot about family structure. So I wanted to kind of throw it out there for you to think about for a minute. What is the best family structure for kids with disabilities? So we have single-parent families, two-parent families, married families. We have gay, lesbian, and bisexual families, 2- and 3-generation families. Like, which one is, the best structure for kids with disabilities? We often hear that single-parent families are not successful and have more difficulties and increased stress that fall onto the kids with disabilities or kids in general, and that we're really finding that that's not the case. So to answer this question, there really is no best family structure. All of these structures that are listed here can be successful structures for kids with disabilities, and there are cases reporting on each of them showing success. Okay, so OT's role. How are we supporting participation in family life for the kiddos we're working with? We are obviously working with kids on ADLs and IADLs, and that really impacts their family life. If they're able to participate in chores, if they're able to dress themselves, that takes a lot of stress off siblings and parents. We also will work on work and productive occupations like school and play and community living. And then also recreation and leisure. Social participation ends up being a big one. We want to make sure that they can develop these friendships as well. Okay, so there's two models here that we often see occupational therapists falling under, and that's kind of that traditional medical model, being expert-driven, hierarchical, and then the family-centered model, where we're really facilitating and collaborating and integrating the family into all of the decisions that are being made. I think it's really important that we don't necessarily do away with everything in the traditional model, that we keep those standards, but we don't just have family component as an add-on. It needs to be family-centered. As we talked about in the beginning, family-centered and culturally competent care are best practices for OT. Okay, whoops. So what are the principles for partnering with families? So how do we do this? We talked a lot about how important it is and how we need to be prepared for different types of families. So how do we work with these families? The first big thing is to have effective communication. So rapport and trust is one of the biggest key factors in facilitating that effective communication. We need to be open and respectful. We need to share the decision making. So we should be working with the parents to make decisions and not necessarily using that expert opinion only as our decision making source. And I think one of the other hugely important factors here is the parental empowerment. That kind of goes back to the human resources. We want to make sure our parents are empowered, that they feel comfortable in their child's diagnosis, in the services being provided, that they understand it, and that they are, fully capable of talking to you about that and of talking to others and being able to ask questions when they need to. We also want to be helpful. We want to give that accurate and correct information. We want to grade the information so that we're talking to the parent at a level that they'll understand. Or, if they learn a certain type of way, we want to use that. If we have a family who is really visual, then maybe provide more documents, provide more pictures, things like that for them to help fully understand it. And make sure that we're providing feasible recommendations. This goes back into the time resource. Make sure you're considering what time they have available and how much they can actually engage in those recommendations that you're providing. You also want to make sure you're flexible. I think that kind of goes back to the shared decision making. Even though you may think there's something that's absolutely monumentally beneficial for a child, you can absolutely promote that and talk to the parent about it. But you need to be flexible if there's certain things that they dislike or that they want to incorporate into their child's care. And then I think the big one is really respecting their decision making. Parents can defer to the OT in decision making, and you should be able to help them with any issues that they may not completely understand. And if you can't help them, I would hope that we would all be able to refer them to somebody who can, or to a source where they can find that information. But remember, they can always veto any decision you wanted to make. They have the final say, and we need to respect that at all times. And the best approach is to use that shared decision making that we talked about to facilitate parents in making difficult decisions for their children. Okay, so this is just kind of a little reminder to consider these points when you're preparing for your standardized patient lab. Granted, you won't be doing an interview with the parents, or you won't have too many specific questions about actual resources. So you may not be able to use a lot of these, but it's still important to consider when you're relaying that information to them. So components like how will they best understand, what information is necessary to provide, and what may be confusing. Make sure you're really thinking about those. Also, please review the video that I posted on Carmen discussing the standardized patient lab, and let me know if you have any questions at all. We are now less than 3 weeks away until the standardized patient lab. So I am fully ready to answer any of your questions, and hope you've started